November 14th, 1945, 6:47 in the morning, Camp Monterey, California. The smell hit them first. Not the usual stench of boiled rice water and mildew that had defined their captivity for 3 endless months. This was different. Rich, fatty, utterly foreign to everything they had known since their capture. Haruka Yamamoto froze at the barracks door, her calloused hand still pressed against the rough wood. Behind her, 43 Japanese women prisoners stirred from restless sleep on their narrow cots. The scent drifted through gaps in the weathered walls like smoke from an unseen fire. Sizzling, crackling, the unmistakable sound of meat cooking in its own fat. Her younger sister, Emiko, appeared at her shoulder, 19 years old, with a face that had aged a decade in just 3 months. The girl's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sister, what is that smell?" Haruka did not answer. She knew that smell. She had encountered it once before 3 years ago in a field hospital near Shanghai. They had treated an injured American pilot before he died from his wounds. His rations had included something the Chinese nurses had whispered about with a mixture of revulsion and strange curiosity. Bacon. American bacon. The guard tower bell clanged across the compound. Sharp, urgent, different from the usual morning assembly call that dragged them from sleep at dawn. Then came the voice, harsh and amplified through a megaphone that made the words bounce off the wooden buildings. "All prisoners, line up outside your quarters. Bring nothing." The translator repeated it in Japanese, his voice tight with an emotion Haruka could not quite identify. Every muscle in her body locked. Every breath became labor. Because every woman in that barracks understood exactly what bring nothing meant. They had heard the stories, whispered in darkness between the cots, passed from camp to camp like an infectious disease that no medicine could cure. When they tell you to bring nothing, you are not coming back. Haruka's hands began to tremble. She reached for Emiko and pulled the girl close. Her little sister, the baby she had promised their mother to protect when the bombs started falling on Osaka. The girl who still folded origami cranes from scraps of bandage gauze when she thought no one was watching, believing in miracles even after everything they had endured. Around them, panic rippled through the barracks. Reiko Sato, 23 years old and 7 months pregnant, clutched her swollen belly with both hands. Tears already streamed down her hollow cheeks. Her husband Kenji had gone missing during the chaos of Okinawa. She carried the only piece of him that remained. Sachiko Tanaka, 58 years old with gray-streaked hair, pulled into a severe bun, stood near her cot with the strange dignity of someone who had already accepted death. She had been a school teacher once, English literature. She had taught Shakespeare to Japanese girls in Yokohama, believing that understanding the West would help her country find its place in the modern world. Then the war came and English became the language of the enemy. The women shuffled outside into the cold November morning. The coastal air bit through their thin prison uniforms, faded gray cotton that had once been white but was now stained with months of sweat and dirt and despair. Their shoes were falling apart, cardboard stuffed inside to cover the holes. They formed ragged lines in the gravel courtyard, and they waited. The smell of bacon grew stronger. It drifted from the direction of the mess hall, carried on the wind that came off the Pacific Ocean, just beyond the barbed wire fences. Haruka stood at attention, her mind racing through memories she had tried so hard to bury. She was 27 years old. She had been a field nurse with the 23rd Infantry Hospital Unit. She had seen things that no person should ever have to see. Not just Japanese soldiers, though there had been so many of those. Boys bleeding out on bamboo stretchers calling for their mothers in dialects she barely understood. But also the civilians. The Okinawan families caught in the crossfire. The grandmother burned beyond recognition, but still clutching her grandson's hand. The teenage girl who had swallowed poison rather than face capture. Haruka had held them all. Bandaged what could be bandaged. Whispered comfort to those beyond any saving. And when the field hospital was overrun during the evacuation, she had been captured still wearing her blood-stained uniform, her medical bag still slung across her shoulder. Her brother Takeshi had been a fighter pilot, 22 years old with eyes that had always been bright with propaganda's certainty about Japan's divine destiny. He had written his last letter 3 months before Midway. "Sister, when I die, know that I died making our family proud. The Americans are monsters who bomb civilians and show no mercy. But we will defeat them with our spirit, with our willingness to sacrifice everything." His plane had gone down somewhere in the vast Pacific. His body was never recovered. No funeral. Just a wooden memorial tablet on the family altar that their mother would never see again because the firebombing of Tokyo had turned their entire neighborhood into ash. Beside her, Emiko shivered, not just from the cold. Her little sister was 19 years old, a factory worker at the Mitsubishi plant in Osaka. She had been captured during the chaotic evacuation when American planes destroyed the harbor. She had been making airplane parts then, riveting metal panels for the very fighters that their brother had flown. Emiko still believed in something, not in victory anymore. That illusion had shattered the moment the Emperor's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender. But she believed in hope, perhaps, or just in the stubborn human refusal to accept that the world could be entirely cruel without mercy. She kept an origami crane in her pocket even now, folded from a scrap of paper she had found near the mess hall 3 weeks ago. "When you fold 1,000 cranes, your wish comes true," she had whispered once in the darkness. She had made 17 so far. Most had been confiscated and thrown away, but she kept folding whenever she found paper. 3 positions down the line stood Sachiko. The older woman had taught English literature before the war. Her husband had been a university professor who spoke against militarism in private conversations. He had disappeared in 1942. She never learned whether he had been imprisoned or executed or simply erased from all official records. She had been visiting her sister in Saipan when the Americans invaded. She was captured during the civilian evacuation. She had watched her sister jump from the cliffs rather than surrender. Now at 58, Sachiko possessed the strange stillness of someone who had already walked through death once and found it less frightening than expected. Reiko Sato could not stop shaking. The baby inside her kicked, strong, insistent, alive and demanding a future that seemed increasingly impossible. What kind of world was she bringing this child into? What kind of future could exist for a baby born in an enemy prison camp? The sound of boots on gravel made every woman in the formation stiffen. Sergeant Frank Barnes appeared first, walking with the controlled fury of a man who carried rage like a second skin. He was 35 years old with burn scars mapping the length of his left forearm. Pearl Harbor survivor. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out like cables beneath weathered skin. Behind him came younger guards. Most looked uncomfortable. Some would not meet the prisoner's eyes. But they all carried rifles and they all followed orders. Then Corporal James Sullivan stepped into view. He was 25 years old, tall and blond with tired blue eyes that seemed older than his face. A medical corpsman armband faded from too many washings encircled his right arm. He carried no rifle, just a medical bag slung over his shoulder. He positioned himself slightly apart from the other guards, his expression carefully neutral. Haruka found herself watching him without meaning to. There was something different about this one, something in the way he held himself. Less certain, less secure in the rightness of what was happening. The camp commander appeared last. Major William Richardson was 48 years old, a career officer with graying temples and no combat experience. He climbed onto the raised platform that had been constructed for morning formations. Behind him, the American flag snapped and rippled in the coastal wind. He held a piece of paper and read from it in a flat, bureaucratic voice. As of November 12, 1945, all prisoners of war in American custody are subject to International Red Cross health and sanitation protocols. You will undergo mandatory medical inspection and decontamination procedures. This is not punishment. This is standard procedure required by international law. You will comply with all instructions given by medical personnel. The translator repeated the words in Japanese, his voice still tight with that strange emotion. Haruka heard the words, but could not make them connect into meaning. Medical inspection, decontamination procedures, not punishment, standard procedure. The phrases felt like traps, like lies wrapped in the language of bureaucracy and international treaties. Then Sergeant Barnes stepped forward. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade drawn from a sheath. Translator, tell them to remove their outer clothing. Silence fell across the compound. Not the simple absence of sound, the presence of horror so complete it consumed everything else. The wind stopped. The birds stopped singing. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The translator's face went white. His hands trembled as he clutched the clipboard he was holding. Sir, I do not think that's an order, Private. The young man's voice shook as he turned to face the women and spoke in Japanese. You are ordered to remove your outer clothing. Someone gasped. The sound ripped through the formation like a stone through glass. One woman, Nurse Ayame, simply fainted. She crumpled to the gravel, and the women on either side of her caught her before she hit the ground. Miko's grip on Haruka's arm turned painful. Her fingers dug in hard enough to leave bruises. Sister, what do we do? Haruka had no answer. Her throat had closed. Her heart hammered so hard against her ribs she thought it might break through. Around them, the fear became a living thing with weight and substance. Reiko clutched her pregnant belly, and tears streamed down her face faster than she could wipe them away. Sachiko closed her eyes and began to whisper what sounded like a Buddhist prayer for the dying. Young Yuki was crying so hard she could not breathe properly. Great gasping sobs that shook her thin frame. In that moment, every story they had ever heard came flooding back. Every nightmare about revenge and humiliation and the things that soldiers did to women when all restraint was stripped away. Every piece of propaganda they had been fed during the war suddenly seemed true. Haruka's hands moved without her conscious control. She reached for the buttons of her prison uniform. Her fingers felt numb, clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. Around her, other women began to comply. Trembling hands struggled with buttons and ties. Some women tried to maintain modesty with torn undergarments that provided no real coverage. Eyes downcast, shoulders hunched forward, trying to make themselves smaller, less visible, less real. Sachiko stood straight, even as she unbuttoned her uniform, trying to model dignity in the face of what was coming. Haruka helped Emiko with her buttons because her sister's hands would not work properly. They shook too violently to grip anything. I'm scared, Emiko whispered. Sister, I'm so scared. I know. The smell of bacon still drifted across the compound, stronger now, almost mocking in its abundance. The scent of American plenty, while they stood half naked in the cold morning air, waiting for whatever came next. Then something unexpected happened. Corporal Sullivan stepped forward. He spoke softly to Sergeant Barnes, then to the translator. The two older men had a brief, tense exchange. Barnes's face flushed red with anger. But finally, reluctantly, he nodded once. The translator looked confused as he repeated the words he had been given. You are not being punished. You are being checked for infections and parasites. This is required medical procedure for your health and safety. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Not punishment, medical procedure. Then Corporal Sullivan gestured toward the corner of the courtyard that had been hidden behind the command building. 6 wooden tubs appeared, carried by guards who would not meet anyone's eyes. Steam rose from the water inside them. Real steam. Hot water, the first they had seen in months. Buckets of soap followed. White bars that looked clean and new. Stacks of towels. Actual cotton towels, not the rags they had been using. And then came the Red Cross nurses. 3 women in crisp white uniforms with red crosses on their armbands emerged from the medical building. They carried bags of supplies. They wore masks and gloves. They moved with calm professionalism, neither hurried nor hesitant. The lead nurse was maybe 32 years old with auburn hair, pulled back in a practical bun. Her name tag read Walsh. She spoke to the translator in clear, measured tones. Tell them we are here to examine them for medical conditions, malnutrition, infections, skin diseases, parasites, any injuries that need treatment. The warm water and soap are for decontamination and comfort. No one will be harmed. We are following Geneva Convention protocols for prisoner health and welfare. The translator repeated it in Japanese, and this time his voice held something that might have been relief. But the women still stood frozen, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the cruelty to begin. Because this could not be real. This had to be a trick. Sergeant Barnes stood off to the side, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. But he made no move to interfere. He simply watched with those cold, assessing eyes. The guards who had carried the tubs turned away, deliberately, giving privacy, facing outward toward the perimeter fence with their backs to the women. The Red Cross nurses approached gently, not threatening, not grabbing, just waiting with infinite patience for the women to understand what was being offered. Haruka looked at the steaming water, at the soap, at the clean towels stacked carefully on a wooden table. Her mind could not process what she was seeing. could not reconcile it with everything she had expected. Where was the cruelty? Where was the revenge? Sachiko spoke quietly in Japanese, her voice steady despite everything. Perhaps they mean what they say. The auburn-haired nurse Walsh stepped closer. She spoke through the translator, her tone gentle. I know you're frightened. I know you don't trust us. But I promise you we're only here to help. You've been through enough. Let us take care of you now. It was the way she said it. Not with pity, not with contempt, but with something that sounded almost like respect. One by one, behind canvas screens that provided privacy, the medical examinations began. When it was Haruka's turn, Nurse Walsh examined her with careful hands. She documented the scars from Haruka's nursing work in the field hospitals. She found the infected wound on Haruka's shoulder that had been festering for 2 weeks. She cleaned it with steady precision and applied antibiotics from a tube that looked impossibly expensive. Then she handed Haruka a warm towel. You'll be okay, she said through the translator. You've been through enough. Her tone was not pity. It was the respect one professional gave to another. One nurse to another, across the battle lines that had divided their countries. Haruka stepped into the warm bath, the first hot water she had touched in 4 months. The soap actually lathered. It smelled clean, medicinal but clean. For the first time since her capture, Haruka let herself cry. Not from fear, not from despair, from the shocking, disorienting realization that she was being treated as a human being again. Around her, other women experienced the same revelation. Emiko sobbed openly as a nurse gently washed her hair and checked her for lice. Reiko was examined by a nurse who spoke softly to her pregnant belly, checking the baby's position with practiced hands. Sachiko accepted a clean towel with a dignified nod, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Even Ayami, who had fainted from fear, was being tended to with genuine medical concern. After the baths, clean uniforms were distributed. Plain gray cotton, but soft and warm and whole. Real cotton underwear, not the rags they had been making do with. Donated shoes that actually fit their feet. Their hair was deloused and cut neatly. Their wounds were treated with real medicine. And through it all, the guards kept their backs turned, giving privacy, offering dignity. When it was over, the women were led to the mess hall, and that was when Haruka smelled it again. Bacon, but closer now, much closer. The mess hall doors opened and the scent rolled out like a wave of heat. Metal trays appeared clanging against the wooden tables. U.S. Army issue. Scratched from years of use, but clean, actually clean. Each woman received the same portion on her tray, 2 strips of bacon, thick cut, crispy at the edges, with fat still glistening in the overhead lights. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, yellow and fluffy and still steaming with heat. Toast, white bread, actually toasted brown, with butter melting into the porous surface. Coffee, bitter and strong and dark as crude oil in tin cups. Orange slices, fresh, not canned, with juice running across the tray and mixing with everything else. Haruka stared at the food like it might explode. She had seen military rations before. She knew this was standard American breakfast. But knowing it and seeing it on a tray in front of her were 2 completely different things. Beside her, Emiko's hands hovered over the food without touching it. Sister, is this real? Around them, every woman faced the same crisis of belief. What kind of trick was this? Sachiko spoke quietly, her English teacher's knowledge surfacing. This is American military rations, standard issue. I recognize it from before the war, when missionaries came to Yokohama. Why would they feed us this? Someone whispered. No one had an answer that made sense. The bacon cooled on the trays. The eggs stopped steaming. The toast absorbed the melted butter until it glistened. And still no one ate. Then Corporal Sullivan entered the mess hall. He carried his own tray. The same food. He sat at the guard's table 15 feet away from the prisoners' section. And he began to eat. Haruka watched him cut his bacon with the edge of his fork, metal scraping against metal. Watched him raise it to his mouth, chew deliberately, swallow. He did not die, did not react with pain or sickness, just ate, like food was supposed to be eaten, like this was normal. Slowly, carefully, Haruka picked up her fork. The metal was cold and heavy, real silverware, not wooden chopsticks or split bamboo or carved spoons. She speared a small piece of bacon. Raised it to her face. The smell was overwhelming up close. Fatty and salty and smoky in a way she had never experienced. "Takeshi, forgive me." She put it in her mouth. The fat melted on her tongue instantly. Salt exploded across her taste buds like a small detonation. The meat itself was crispy on the outside but chewy inside. Texture she had never encountered. Pork, yes, but transformed by heat and fat and American abundance into something entirely new. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, and that realization made her cry again. Not from joy, from the stunning, disorienting horror of discovering that the enemy made beautiful food. The propaganda crumbled in the face of crispy bacon and real butter. How could she sustain hatred toward people who created something this generous? Around her, other women began to eat. Some cried openly. Some ate mechanically, their faces blank. Some savored every bite like it might be their last meal on earth. Reiko took a small bite of egg and immediately began sobbing. Her baby kicked stronger than it had in days, as if even the unborn child recognized nourishment after weeks of deprivation. Sachiko ate with perfect composure, but tears ran down her weathered cheeks unchecked. Emiko whispered between bites, "Why does their food taste like home should have tasted?" Haruka had no answer. From across the room, Corporal Sullivan watched them. His tired blue eyes held an expression she could not quite read. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something else. Something that looked almost like sadness. He had requested this specifically, the bacon breakfast. He had argued with Sergeant Barnes for 20 minutes about it. Barnes had wanted to maintain minimum rations. Sullivan had insisted on following proper protocols, because he remembered what his brother Thomas had written in that last letter before Iwo Jima. "Jim, when this is over, first thing I'm doing is coming home for Mom's bacon and eggs, Sunday morning. The smell of it cooking. That's what I'm fighting for. That's what America means to me." Thomas never got that breakfast. A Japanese machine gun nest at Iwo Jima had ended that future before it could begin. But these women could have it. These enemy prisoners. These people who belonged to the country that had killed his brother. And maybe, just maybe, that was what mercy looked like in a world gone mad with violence. Giving your enemy the meal your brother died protecting. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean and painted the sky in shades of orange and red, Haruka sat on the wooden step outside her barracks. Emiko sat beside her. Both sisters held tin cups of coffee, still warm from dinner. The wire fencing still enclosed them. The guard towers still watched. They were still prisoners in a foreign land, but something had shifted. Some fundamental assumption about the world had cracked open and let in a sliver of light. "Sister," Emiko said quietly, "what do we do now?" Haruka stared at the distant horizon where ocean met sky. "I don't know, but maybe we stop expecting monsters and start seeing people." That night, for the first time in 3 months, Haruka slept without nightmares. Not peacefully, but without the bone-deep terror that had been her constant companion since capture. And in her pocket, she kept the small piece of paper that Corporal Sullivan had left near her tray at dinner. Just 3 words in carefully written Japanese characters. "You are safe." She did not know if she could believe it yet, but for the first time she wanted to try one. November 18th, 1945. The convoy of military trucks rumbled north along Highway 1, carrying the prisoners toward their new confinement. Haruka pressed her face against the canvas side of the truck bed, watching California landscape roll past. Through the gap, she caught glimpses of the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly to the west. The same ocean that separated her from everything she had known. The same ocean that had swallowed her brother's plane and 10,000 other young men who had believed the propaganda about divine destiny. The smell of salt air mixed with diesel exhaust. Pine trees replaced the scrub brush of the inland camp. The road curved along coastal bluffs where seagulls wheeled and cried in the cold November sky. Emiko sat beside her, eyes wide, with something that might have been wonder if wonder were still possible in their circumstances. "Look, sister, the birds." It was the first time in months that Emiko had pointed out something beautiful without immediately remembering why beauty was dangerous, why hope was a trap. Haruka squeezed her sister's hand, but said nothing. After 2 hours, the trucks turned through a gate marked Camp Monterey. The sign was new, recently painted, almost welcoming in a way that made Haruka's stomach tighten with suspicion. The camp sat on a bluff overlooking Monterey Bay. Barbed wire still enclosed the perimeter and guard towers still punctuated the corners with their silent watchers. But the buildings looked different. Wooden barracks that seemed maintained rather than merely functional. Windows that actually opened. Garden plots between the structures where vegetables grew in neat rows. When the truck stopped and the women climbed down, Haruka noticed details that felt wrong. Not threatening wrong, just unexpected wrong. The gravel pathways were raked clean. The barracks had proper steps instead of stacked crates. Someone had planted flowers near the command building. Actual flowers. Bright yellow chrysanthemums that served no functional purpose except to be beautiful. What kind of prison camp planted flowers? The barracks assigned to them proved her both right and wrong. Inside, the space was clean, genuinely clean, not just swept, but scrubbed. Each woman had her own cot with a real mattress, not straw or canvas stretched over wooden slats. Actual pillows, blankets that smelled of soap instead of mildew and other women's fear. Small wooden lockers stood between the cots, empty now, but offering the promise of personal space. Private storage. The radical concept that prisoners might own things worth protecting. At the far end, a separate room held showers. Real showers with individual stalls and curtains for privacy. Emiko sat on her assigned cot and bounced slightly, testing the mattress. Her eyes went wide. "Sister, it's soft." Around them, other women explored with the same mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. But Haruka remained standing, watching, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. That evening, dinner arrived on schedule. The mess hall at Camp Coastal Monterey held long tables with benches that did not wobble. Windows looked out over the pine forest and distant ocean. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, bright enough to actually see the food on their trays. And the food itself proved that the bacon breakfast had not been an isolated gesture. Vegetable soup with actual vegetables, chunks of carrot and potato and celery floating in rich broth. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven with butter, available in small dishes. Rice cooked properly, not the watery gruel they had endured for months. And fish, real fish, grilled with herbs that made the entire hall smell like a restaurant Haruka remembered from before the war. Coffee, milk for those who wanted it, even small cookies for dessert. Haruka ate slowly, analyzing each bite, looking for signs of degradation, of cheapness, of the inevitable moment when standards would slip. But the food remained good, remained generous, remained inexplicable. Corporal Sullivan appeared in the mess hall doorway. He did not enter. Just stood there for a moment, his medical bag over his shoulder, surveying the room with those tired blue eyes. His gaze found Haruka's for just a second. He nodded once. Then he was gone. Emiko noticed her sister's attention drift toward the door. "That's the one who helped us, at the other camp." "I know. He seems different from the others." Haruka had no response. She returned her attention to the soup, but the taste had changed. Now it carried questions she could not answer. The routine at Camp Coastal Monterey established itself with surprising speed. Wake at dawn to the sound of a bell, not shouted orders. Morning roll call in the courtyard, but brief and businesslike. Work assignments distributed fairly. Kitchen duty, laundry, garden maintenance, cleaning the shared spaces. But the work was lighter than before. Reasonable hours, breaks for water and rest. No one shouted, no one struck anyone for moving too slowly or making small mistakes. The change was so profound that it felt dangerous, like standing on ice that looked solid but might crack without warning. Haruka drew work assignment in the camp infirmary. Her nursing background had been noted in her file, and the medical staff needed assistance with routine care. She reported to the infirmary on the third morning at Camp Coastal Monterey. The building was small but well-equipped. Examination table, cabinets stocked with supplies, bandages and antiseptics and medications arranged in orderly rows. A desk with medical charts, windows that let in natural light. Nurse Walsh, the auburn-haired Red Cross woman from the inspection, stood waiting. She smiled when Haruka entered. "Good morning. The translator told me you were a nurse before your capture. Field hospital experience." Haruka nodded, not trusting her limited English. "Excellent. We need help with daily health checks, making sure everyone's recovering from the malnutrition, monitoring Reiko's pregnancy, treating minor injuries and infections. Can you do that?" Another nod. Walsh gestured to the supply cabinets. "Everything's organized by type. Use what you need. If we run low on anything, let me know and I'll requisition more. Questions. Haruka's English failed her completely. She simply stood there trying to process the idea that she would have access to real medical supplies. Walsh seemed to understand without words. She pulled out a medical textbook from the desk drawer. English language but filled with diagrams that transcended vocabulary. For you, to help with terminology, you can keep it. She set the book on the desk between them like an offering. Haruka stared at it. A gift, an actual gift. Medical knowledge freely given to an enemy prisoner. Arigato, she whispered. Thank you. Walsh smiled. You're welcome. The work proved both familiar and strange. Familiar because bodies were bodies regardless of nationality. Infections needed cleaning. Wounds needed dressing. Malnutrition required careful refeeding to avoid refeeding syndrome. Strange because she was doing this work for her fellow prisoners under the supervision of enemy medical personnel who treated her like a colleague rather than a captive. Corporal Sullivan worked the infirmary as well. Medical corpsman duties that overlapped with Nurse Walsh's Red Cross responsibilities. He came and went throughout the day, bringing supplies, checking on patients, administering medications prescribed by the camp doctor. He and Haruka developed a wordless system of cooperation. She would prepare bandages. He would bring patients who needed dressing changes. She would note symptoms. He would document them in the medical charts with his careful handwriting. She would mix antiseptic solutions. He would sterilize instruments. No conversation. Just the quiet efficiency of two medical professionals working toward the same goal despite the war that had put them on opposite sides. On the 5th day at Camp Coastal Monterey, Sachiko Tanaka fell ill. It started with a cough. Small at first, easy to dismiss as the result of cold coastal air and the changing weather. But by evening, the cough had deepened, wet and rattling. By the next morning, Sachiko burned with fever. Haruka found her on her cot barely conscious, skin hot to the touch. Breathing labored. When she coughed, flecks of blood appeared on her lips. Pneumonia, advanced, complicated by months of malnutrition and the general weakening that came from prolonged stress and inadequate care. Haruka ran to the infirmary. Nurse Walsh examined Sachiko immediately. Her expression grew grave as she listened to the older woman's lungs through her stethoscope. Pneumonia, severe. She needs proper antibiotics. The strong ones, penicillin. Walsh went to the radio and called the main base hospital, requested an emergency shipment of medications. 2 hours later, she returned to the infirmary with her face tight with controlled anger. Request denied. Haruka's limited English caught the important word. She looked at Walsh with growing alarm. The nurse explained through the translator, her voice shaking slightly. Sergeant Barnes, he's in charge of medical supply allocation. He denied the requisition. Said our basic antibiotics here are sufficient, that we can't justify using the strongest medications on prisoners when our own men might need them. But she will die. Haruka said in halting English. I know. Walsh's hands clenched into fists. I know. Haruka spent the next 2 days trying to keep Sachiko alive with insufficient tools. She administered the weaker antibiotics available in the infirmary. She kept the older woman hydrated with water and broth. She positioned her to help with breathing. She stayed up through the nights monitoring every breath, every spike of fever, every moment of delirium, when Sachiko called for her dead husband in voices that broke Haruka's heart. Corporal Sullivan appeared frequently. He brought extra blankets. He helped reposition Sachiko when the coughing grew too severe. He looked at the medical charts with an expression that told Haruka he understood exactly what was happening. On the second night when Walsh had gone off duty and Haruka sat alone in the infirmary, with her dying patient, Sullivan entered, carrying something hidden in his medical bag. He looked around carefully, checking that they were alone, that no one else was near. Then he placed the bag on the desk between himself and Haruka. Inside, clearly visible, sat 2 vials of penicillin and a box of syringes. Haruka stared at them, then at Sullivan, then back at the medications that should not exist in this room. He met her eyes, held her gaze, let her see what he was offering. Theft, court-martial if discovered, career ending, possibly imprisonment, all of that in 2 vials of clear liquid that could save Sachiko's life. He spoke softly in English, too quiet for any guard outside to hear. Haruka caught only fragments, but Walsh had taught her enough medical terminology to understand the essential meaning. Every 4 hours, intramuscular injection. Hide them. If anyone asked, say Walsh got approval through different channels. Then he was gone, walking out of the infirmary into the night as if nothing had happened. Haruka stood frozen. The penicillin sat on the desk like a live grenade. She could report this. Report Sullivan's theft to the camp authorities. Follow the rules. Stay safe. Let Sachiko die according to proper protocols and regulations. Or she could become complicit in theft of military medical supplies. Break the rules that governed her captivity. Trust an American soldier who had every reason to hate her and her people. All to save one older woman who had taught Shakespeare to Japanese schoolgirls before the world went mad. Her hands trembled as she reached for the first vial. She administered the injection while Sachiko slept. Intramuscular, just as she had done 1,000 times in the field hospitals. 4 hours later, she gave the second dose, and 4 hours after that. When Walsh arrived in the morning, Haruka told her the prepared lie, that Walsh's requisition had been approved through alternate channels, that the penicillin had arrived during the night shift. I found. Walsh looked at her for a long moment, then at the medical supply log where no shipment was recorded. Then back at Haruka. She said nothing, just nodded once and went to check on Sachiko's vitals. Over the next 3 days, Sachiko's fever broke. The rattling in her lungs diminished. The blood disappeared from her cough. Color returned to her face. She would live. And Haruka had become something she had never intended to be. A conspirator, someone who trusted the enemy enough to break rules together, someone who had chosen mercy over obedience. The realization terrified her more than any threat of punishment. Sullivan did not speak to her about the penicillin, but their wordless cooperation in the infirmary continued, now with an added weight, a shared secret that bound them in ways that transcended language and nationality. He brought supplies without being asked. She prepared them without needing instructions. One afternoon, he left better quality paper in a set of pencils near her workstation, for medical documentation presumably. But they both knew she also used them to sketch. Days later, she left a small origami crane on his desk, made from a scrap of that better paper, folded with the precision that came from making 17 of them under worse conditions. He hung it in the corner of the infirmary, a small splash of color against white walls. They never discussed it, just acknowledged the gesture through continued quiet cooperation. Amiko noticed the change in her sister. You trust him. Haruka was washing bandages in the infirmary sink. She kept her attention on her hands, on the red-brown stains that required cold water and patience to remove. I trust that he wants to do his job properly. That's not what I meant. Haruka finally looked up, met her sister's knowing gaze. What do you want me to say? That I trust Americans now, that everything we were told was lies, that the people who bombed our cities are actually good? I want you to say what's true. The bandages dripped water into the sink. The sound filled the silence between them. The truth is complicated, Haruka said finally. Some Americans are like Sergeant Barnes, full of hate that will never heal. And some are like Corporal Sullivan, trying to be decent in circumstances that make decency nearly impossible. They're not all the same, just like we're not all the same. And what does that mean for us? I don't know yet, but she was beginning to suspect. November turned toward December. The weather grew colder. Rain came in sheets that drummed on the barracks roofs and turned the compound into a maze of puddles and mud. The prisoners received warmer clothing, real jackets, gloves for those who worked outside, scarves knitted by Red Cross volunteers whose names they would never know. On December 1st, an announcement came during morning formation. A Red Cross International Committee inspector would arrive on December 8th to evaluate camp conditions, to interview prisoners about their treatment, to ensure compliance with all international protocols. Camp Commander Richardson delivered the news himself. His expression was carefully neutral. Around Haruka, the women exchanged glances. Was this good news or dangerous news, an opportunity or a trap? That afternoon, Sergeant Barnes appeared in the compound for the first time since they had arrived at Camp Coastal Monterey. He had been stationed elsewhere, they had heard, reassigned after some dispute with the camp command. But now he was back, temporary duty. Until after the Red Cross inspection, his presence changed everything. The air itself seemed to contract. Guards who had been relatively relaxed suddenly stood straighter, moved with more aggressive purpose, watched the prisoners with eyes that assessed rather than merely observed. Barnes walked through the women's work areas with his clipboard, noting everything, the garden plots, the kitchen, the barracks. His burned left arm hung at his side, a constant reminder of Pearl Harbor and everything that had been taken from him. He stopped at the infirmary. Haruka was treating a minor cut on Yuki's hand when Barnes entered. Sullivan was across the room organizing supplies. Walsh was in the back, reviewing patient charts. Barnes looked at the well-stocked cabinets, at the clean examination table, at the medical equipment arranged with professional care. Corporal Sullivan. Sullivan straightened. Yes, Sergeant. Medical supply inventory. I need a complete accounting before the inspection. Every bandage, every medication, every piece of equipment. Cross-reference it with requisition records. Yes, Sergeant. I'll have it ready tomorrow. Barnes's gaze moved to Haruka, swept over her like she was an obstacle in his path. She works here now? Yes, Sergeant, medical assistant. Her nursing experience has been invaluable for... I don't care about her experience. I care about security. Prisoners don't get unsupervised access to medical supplies. New protocol, effective immediately. All work in this infirmary will be directly supervised by American personnel at all times. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Sergeant, she's been working here for 2 weeks without incident. Her help has allowed us to... Are you questioning my orders, Corporal? No, Sergeant. Good, because I'm also implementing new restrictions for the inspection period. Reduced recreation time, extended work hours, no personal items in barracks. We need this camp to pass inspection, and that means discipline. Understanding. Yes, Sergeant. Barnes left. In the silence that followed, Sullivan's hands gripped the edge of the desk hard enough to make his knuckles white. Walsh emerged from the back room. He's going to make everyone miserable until that inspector leaves. Yes. And if the women complain to the inspector about the new restrictions, Barnes will make sure there are consequences after he leaves. Yes. This is wrong. Sullivan looked at her, then at Haruka, who understood enough to know that something bad had just happened, even if she could not follow all the rapid English. I know it's wrong, but what can we do about it? Nobody had an answer. That night, as rain hammered the barracks roof and wind howled through the pine trees, Emiko whispered to her sister in the darkness, "What happens if we tell the inspector the truth about Barnes, about the restrictions? He punishes us after the inspector leaves, when there are no witnesses. And if we say nothing, nothing changes. We stay in this uncertain place, better than before, but worse than it could be. So we have no good choices." Haruka stared at the ceiling, at shadows cast by the small lamp that burned near the door. "We have one choice. We can trust that some people will fight for what's right even when we can't, even when it costs them." You mean Corporal Sullivan? Maybe. That's a lot of faith to put in one person. I know. But she had put her faith in him once already, when she had accepted those stolen vials of penicillin and saved Sachiko's life, when she had become complicit in his mercy. Maybe that faith would be rewarded. Maybe it would be betrayed. In 6 days, when the Red Cross inspector arrived, they would find out which. December 7th, 1945. The day before the Red Cross inspection. Haruka woke to screaming, not the controlled fear of women who had learned to swallow their terror. This was primal, animal, the sound of someone whose body had overridden all restraint. She was on her feet before consciousness fully returned. Around her, other women bolted upright in their cots. The screaming came from Reiko's cot near the back of the barracks. Haruka ran, her bare feet slapped against cold wood. She reached Reiko just as Sachiko arrived from the other direction, both of them moving with the practiced speed of women who had seen too many emergencies. Reiko lay curled on her side, both hands clutching her swollen belly. Her face was contorted. Her prison uniform was soaked, not with sweat, with fluid, clear and streaked with red. Her water had broken, but the blood meant something was very wrong. "The baby," Reiko gasped between contractions. "Something's wrong. Sister, the baby's not moving right." Haruka pressed her hands to Reiko's abdomen, felt the contraction rippling through distended muscle, felt the hardness of the baby's position. Too high, too transverse. not engaged in the birth canal the way it should be at 8 months. Breach, or worse. Sachiko, get Nurse Walsh. Now, run. The older woman was already moving, out the barracks door into the December night, her calls for help echoing across the compound. Walsh arrived within minutes. Sullivan was right behind her medical bag already open. They assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of people who had seen complications before. We need to move her to the infirmary, now. Sullivan, get a stretcher. No time, I'll carry her. Sullivan lifted Reiko like she weighed nothing. The pregnant woman screamed again as movement triggered another contraction. He moved fast across the compound toward the medical building, Walsh and Haruka running beside him. The infirmary lights blazed on. Walsh swept everything off the examination table. Sullivan laid Reiko down as gently as combat conditions allowed. Walsh examined her quickly. Her face went pale. The baby's breech, footling breech, and the cord is prolapsed. I can feel it. If we don't get this baby out in the next 20 minutes, it dies. Maybe the mother too. We need the base hospital. Full surgical team. Emergency C-section. That's the only way to save them both. Sullivan was already moving toward the radio, but Sergeant Barnes appeared in the doorway. He had been woken by the commotion. He stood there in his undershirt with his burned arm, exposed eyes hard. What's happening? Emergency obstetric complication. I need immediate transport to base hospital for surgical delivery. Denied. The word dropped like a stone into water. Walsh spun to face him. Sergeant, this woman and her baby will die without proper surgical intervention. Then they die. No Japanese prisoner gets transported to base hospital. No exceptions, especially not the night before inspection. This is a medical emergency. This is war, Nurse Walsh. People die in war. That's how it works. Sullivan stepped forward. His voice was carefully controlled, but Haruka could see the rage vibrating through him. Sergeant Barnes, sir, with respect, the war is over. These are prisoners under our protection. We have obligations under Geneva Convention, Article 15. Don't lecture me about obligations, Corporal. My obligation is to American servicemen, not to the people whose country killed my wife. You want to save this prisoner, do it here, with what you have. Or don't, I don't care which. He turned to leave. Walsh's voice stopped him. If she dies because you denied transport, I will document every detail in my Red Cross report. The inspector arrives tomorrow. He will read exactly what happened here, and why. Barnes looked back at her. His face was stone. You do what you think is right, nurse. So will I. He left. Walsh stood frozen for 3 seconds. Then she moved. We do the delivery here. Emergency surgical intervention. We have local anesthetic. We have surgical tools. We don't have everything we need, but we have enough to try. She looked at Sullivan. I need you to assist. You've done field surgery. Yes, in the Pacific. Nothing like this. It'll have to do. Then she looked at Haruka. Can you do this? Have you assisted with surgical deliveries before? Haruka understood enough. She nodded. Okinawa, field hospital, many times. Under what conditions? Bombs, no power, almost no supplies. Walsh's expression shifted. Recognition of shared experience. Then you know what we're facing. Yes. Can you handle it? I must. Walsh began pulling supplies from cabinets. Surgical drapes, scalpels, sutures, clamps. Sullivan scrubbed his hands at the sink. Haruka did the same. Walsh prepared the anesthetic. A series of local injections that would numb the surgical field but leave Reiko conscious. She would feel everything except the actual cutting. Reiko looked up at the 3 faces above her. Enemy nurse, enemy soldier, fellow prisoner. Her life and her baby's life in their hands. Please, she whispered in Japanese, save my baby, even if you can't save me. Promise me. Save my baby. Haruka took her hand. We save both, I promise. She had no right to make that promise, but she made it anyway. Walsh positioned herself at the surgical field. Sullivan stood ready to assist. Haruka monitored Reiko's vital signs and stood ready to receive the infant. Ready, Walsh asked. Both assistants nodded. Then let's bring this baby into the world. The incision was clean. Walsh had steady hands despite the circumstances. She cut through skin and fat and muscle with precision. Blood welled up. Sullivan suctioned. Haruka provided instruments before Walsh had to ask for them. The uterus appeared, distended and purple, contracting irregularly. Walsh made the second incision carefully, through the uterine wall, into the amniotic sac that held the baby. More blood, too much blood. Reiko's pressure was dropping. She's hemorrhaging. Sullivan, we need to get this baby out now. His hands joined Walsh's in the surgical field. Together, they reached into Reiko's body and grasped the tiny feet that had presented first instead of the head. Gently but firmly, they pulled. The baby emerged in stages. Feet, legs, torso. The cord was wrapped around the neck, blue and pulseless. Sullivan unwrapped it with fingers that moved with surprising gentleness. Arms, shoulders, and finally the head. A baby girl, Winnie, premature, covered in blood and vernix, not breathing, not making any sound at all. Walsh clamped and cut the cord, passed the infant to Haruka. The baby was limp in her hands, skin blue-gray, no respiratory effort, no heartbeat that she could detect. She cleared the infant's mouth and nose, positioned the tiny head to open the airway, began rescue breathing, small puffs of air into lungs the size of walnuts. "Come on," she whispered in Japanese. "Breathe, you must breathe. Your mother is waiting, your whole life is waiting. Breathe." Nothing. She placed 2 fingers on the baby's chest, found the position over the heart, began compressions, 30 per minute, tiny careful compressions that could save or could break ribs if done wrong. Behind her, Walsh was trying to control Reiko's hemorrhage. Sullivan had his hands inside Reiko's abdomen, applying pressure to bleeding vessels. "How's the baby?" Walsh called out. Haruka did not answer. She was counting compressions, breathing for the infant, watching for any sign of independent life. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Sullivan glanced over his shoulder, saw what Haruka was doing, saw the blue baby that was not responding. He made a decision. "Walsh, I need to leave you for 30 seconds. "What?" "No, I need you here. The baby needs blood. Universal donor. I'm O negative." He was already moving, pulling his arm free from the surgical field, grabbing a tourniquet and needle from the supply cabinet. He tied off his own arm, found his vein, drew blood directly into a syringe, brought it to Haruka. "Umbilical vein. Push it slow." She understood, took the syringe with bloody hands, found the stump of umbilical cord still attached to the baby, located the vein, pushed the needle in, American soldier's blood flowing into Japanese baby. She injected slowly, watched the infant's color, kept doing compressions with her other hand, and then the baby gasped. A small sound, barely audible, but a breath, an independent breath. Another gasp. The baby's chest rose on its own. Color began to return, blue-gray shifting toward pink. The tiny girl opened her mouth and cried. It was the most beautiful sound Haruka had ever heard. Behind them, Walsh had stopped the hemorrhaging. Reiko was stable, pale from blood loss but alive, breathing. Her eyes fluttered open. "My baby." Haruka wrapped the infant in a clean towel, brought her to her mother, placed the tiny girl on Reiko's chest. "Your daughter. She lives. You both live." Reiko began to cry. Her hands came up to touch her baby with fingers that trembled. The infant nuzzled against her mother's skin, still crying but with decreasing urgency as she found warmth and familiar heartbeat. Walsh finished the surgical closure. Layer by layer, muscle, fat, skin. Sullivan leaned against the wall. His arm was still bleeding from where he had drawn blood. Haruka grabbed gauze and wrapped it quickly, applied pressure. He did not seem to notice. He just stared at the baby girl crying on her mother's chest. The door opened. Sergeant Barnes stood there. He had heard the infant's cry. He looked at the scene before him, the successful surgery, the living mother and child, the blood everywhere. His face was unreadable. "You disobeyed my orders." Walsh pulled down her surgical mask. Blood spattered her uniform. "We saved 2 lives, Sergeant, following Geneva Convention medical care requirements, which supersede your authority. That's not for you to decide. Actually, under the Red Cross Charter, it is exactly for me to decide. And I've decided that when you denied emergency transport, you violated international humanitarian law, which I will document in my report, which the inspector will read tomorrow." Barnes's jaw clenched. The burn scars on his arms seemed to pulse with his rage. "You're making an enemy, Nurse Walsh." "No, Sergeant. I'm doing my job." "There's a difference." He looked at Sullivan. "And you drew your own blood for a prisoner." "Yes, Sergeant." "You understand that's not standard procedure." "I understand that the alternative was watching an infant die when I had the ability to prevent it." "Sir." Barnes stared at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Some calculation or memory or internal battle that played out in silence. Finally, he spoke. "The inspector arrives at 0900 hours tomorrow. This infirmary will be spotless. The patient and infant will be presentable. The medical documentation will be complete and accurate. Is that understood?" "Yes, Sergeant." Barnes turned to leave. Stopped in the doorway. Did not look back. "That baby, what's her name?" Reiko looked up from her daughter. Spoke in halting English that Sachiko had been teaching her. "Megumi, it means blessing." Barnes said nothing, but his shoulders shifted, some small release of tension that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing at all. He left. The next morning, December 8, 1945, Dr. Heinrich Muller of the Swiss Red Cross arrived at Camp Coastal Monterey precisely at 9 o'clock. He was 60 years old with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He carried a leather portfolio and a reputation for absolute integrity that made commanders nervous across 3 continents. Camp Commander Richardson met him at the gate with full military courtesy. The tour began immediately. Muller inspected everything: barracks, kitchen, work areas, garden plots. He asked questions in precise English with a German accent. He took notes in neat handwriting. At 11 o'clock, he reached the infirmary. Walsh showed him the facilities, the supplies, the medical records. He examined everything with meticulous attention. Then Sachiko Tanaka appeared. The English teacher whom Haruka had saved with stolen penicillin. She had been selected as spokesperson for the prisoners because of her language skills. Muller interviewed her with Sergeant Barnes standing silently in the corner. "Mrs. Tanaka, how would you describe your medical care in this facility?" Sachiko looked at Barnes, then at Walsh, then back at Muller. "The care has been adequate to good. We receive regular health checks. Wounds and illnesses are treated promptly." "Adequate to good. Can you elaborate?" "When I developed pneumonia 2 weeks ago, I received antibiotics that saved my life. The medical staff worked very hard to ensure my recovery. I see the medical logs show a requisition for penicillin was initially denied, then approved through alternate channels. Can you explain what happened?" Silence fell across the infirmary. Barnes's eyes were fixed on Sachiko. A silent warning. But Sachiko had taught Shakespeare for 30 years. She knew how to parse language, how to tell truth without revealing everything. "I do not know the administrative details of how medicine is allocated. I know only that when I needed it, it arrived, and I am alive because of it." Technically true, completely misleading, perfect testimony. Muller made a note. "And the quality of your rations? Much improved in recent weeks. We receive adequate calories, fresh vegetables, protein regularly. Have you been mistreated in any way?" Sachiko paused, chose her words carefully. "The conditions here are significantly better than many expected. We are treated according to international standards. Some guards show more compassion than others. But we have not been subjected to abuse." Then he asked the question that made everyone in the room tense. "I understand there was a medical emergency last night. A surgical delivery. Can you tell me about that?" Barnes shifted his weight. Walsh's hands clenched at her sides. Sachiko looked at the Swiss doctor with eyes that had seen her sister jump from a cliff rather than surrender. "Yes, Reiko Sato gave birth to a daughter, Megumi. There were complications. The medical staff here performed emergency surgery and saved both lives. It was remarkable work under difficult circumstances. I would like to see the mother and infant." "Of course." They moved to the recovery area where Reiko rested with her baby. Muller examined them both with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many emergency medical situations. He reviewed Walsh's surgical notes. "Nurse Walsh, this says you performed a cesarean section with only local anesthetic and limited surgical supplies." "Yes, doctor." "And you had assistance from Corporal Sullivan and a Japanese prisoner with nursing experience." "Yes, doctor. Haruka Yamamoto, former field nurse. Her experience was invaluable." "I see. More notes. And the infant required resuscitation and blood transfusion. Yes, doctor. Corporal Sullivan donated his blood directly. O-negative universal donor. It saved the baby's life. Mueller looked at Sullivan, who stood at attention near the door. You drew your own blood during an emergency surgical procedure and administered it to a prisoner's infant. Yes, sir. That's quite irregular. Yes, sir, but effective. The faintest hint of a smile crossed Mueller's face. Indeed. He made several more notes, then closed his portfolio. I've seen enough here. Thank you all for your cooperation. He prepared to leave, then stopped, turned back to face Sergeant Barnes directly. Sergeant, I understand you were the senior NCO on duty when this emergency occurred. Yes, sir. And I understand there was some discussion about transport to base hospital. Barnes's jaw tightened. There were security considerations, sir, and resource allocation questions. I see, and your decision was to deny transport. My decision was to handle the emergency with available resources at this facility, which resources proved adequate due to the exceptional skill of your medical personnel. Had they been less skilled, the outcome might have been different. Yes, sir. In my report, I will note that this facility's medical staff performed admirably under difficult circumstances. I will also note that future emergencies should be handled with all available resources, including transport to advanced medical facilities when indicated, regardless of the nationality of the patient. It was not quite a reprimand, but close enough that everyone understood what Mueller was saying. Understood, sir. Mueller nodded once, then left to continue his inspection. The official report arrived 3 days later. Camp Coastal Monterey received satisfactory marks in all categories. Medical care was specifically commended. Minor recommendations were made regarding emergency protocols and supply chain management. And Sergeant Barnes received orders for immediate transfer, stateside assignment, administrative duty in Washington, effective immediately. On his last day, he stood in the compound, watching the women work in the garden plots. The December sun was weak through coastal fog, the smell of pine trees mixed with ocean salt. Sullivan found him there. Sergeant, Corporal. They stood in silence for a moment. I never apologized, Barnes said finally, for Pearl Harbor, for what happened there. You weren't at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, Sergeant. No, but they were. He gestured toward the Japanese women. Their country, their military, their plane. These women didn't fly those planes. I know that. In my head, I know that. But here, he touched his chest. Here, it's harder. Yes, sir. That baby, Megumi. When I heard her cry, I thought of my wife. Mary was a nurse. She would have done what Walsh did, what you did, saved the life in front of her, regardless of everything else. I think she would have been proud of that. Barnes looked at him finally. Maybe, or maybe she'd be ashamed that it took me this long to understand. He walked away then, toward the gate where a jeep waited to take him to his new assignment. His war was not over. But perhaps it had changed shape, become something he could carry differently. Sullivan watched him go, then returned to the infirmary where Haruka was conducting daily health checks. She looked up when he entered. They had not spoken much since the night of the delivery, both of them processing what they had done, what it meant that they had conspired twice now to save lives in defiance of regulations and command authority. He set something on her workstation, a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it carefully. Inside was a medical textbook, Advanced Obstetrics, English Language, several years old but well-maintained, and beneath it a small box, American chewing gum, 5 sticks, wrapped in foil. She looked at him with questions in her eyes. For your continued education, he said, gesturing to the book. And the gum is just, it's American. Thought you might want to try it. She picked up 1 stick, unwrapped it slowly. The scent was sweet, artificial, strange. What is flavor? Spearmint. She put it in her mouth, began to chew. Her eyes widened at the burst of sweetness. It's strange. Yeah, it takes getting used to. But good strange. I think so. She chewed for a moment longer, processing this small gesture of normalcy, of cultural sharing. Corporal Sullivan? Yes. Thank you for everything, for the medicine, for helping Sachiko, for saving Megumi, for treating us like humans. He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. It's just doing what's right. No, it's choosing to do what's right when it would be easier not to. There is difference. He had no response to that. They stood in the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other, despite language barriers and national divisions. December moved toward its end. The prisoners learned that repatriation would begin in January. Ships would take them back to Japan, back to whatever remained of their homes and families and lives. The news brought mixed emotions: relief at going home, fear of what home had become, sadness at leaving a place that had somehow transformed from prison to something more complicated. On December 20th, a small ceremony was held in the mess hall. The women had made gifts for the medical staff: origami flowers folded from any paper they could find, small carved figures made from scrap wood in the workshop. Haruka's gift to Walsh was a detailed medical illustration: the human circulatory system drawn with anatomical precision and artistic beauty. Walsh accepted it with tears in her eyes. "I'll hang this in every infirmary I work in for the rest of my career." For Sullivan, Haruka had something different. She had saved a lock of her hair, cut it carefully, wrapped it in a small piece of cloth. In Japanese tradition, it was a mourning gift, a remembrance of someone who had passed or would soon be gone from your life. She gave it to him without explanation. He accepted it the same way. Then he gave her his gifts. First, his mother's locket, gold and worn smooth from decades of being carried in a pocket and touched for comfort. Inside was a photograph, a family, mother, father, two boys. One of the boys wore a military uniform. Thomas, my brother, he died at Iwo Jima. Haruka held the locket carefully, looked at the face of the young man who had died fighting her countrymen. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your, too, for your brother, for everyone you lost." She started to close the locket. He stopped her. "Keep it, and there's an address inside. My family's farm in Nebraska, if you ever need anything. If you ever want to write or visit or just know that someone remembers." She unfolded the small piece of paper tucked behind the photograph. An address written in careful script: Sullivan Farm, Rural, Route 2, Alliance, Nebraska. "I cannot visit America. I am enemy prisoner. The war's over. Someday maybe things will be different. Maybe people will be able to cross those oceans again. Maybe." She did not believe it, but she kept the locket anyway. The second gift was a photograph. The photograph had been taken by Walsh several weeks ago. It showed Haruka and Sullivan standing together in the infirmary, both in their medical clothes, both looking tired but professional. On the back he had written in English. Walsh had helped translate it into Japanese. "So you'll remember, not all Americans, not all Japanese, just people who chose mercy. James Sullivan, December 1945." Haruka held the photograph and felt something crack open in her chest. Some long frozen place that had been holding grief and fear and rage like ice holding water. She began to cry. Not delicate tears, full sobbing that shook her frame and made her gasp for breath. Years of held emotion finally breaking free. Emiko was there immediately, arms around her sister, letting her cry without asking why or trying to stop it. When Haruka could finally speak, she looked at Sullivan through tears. "When the war started, they told us Americans were monsters, that you would show no mercy, that you would torture and kill us without thought. I believed them. And then I came here, and you gave us bacon and hot water and medicine, and you saved Megumi with your own blood. And now I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe that people are complicated, that countries make war, but individuals make choices. And sometimes those choices matter more than the flags we were born under. Is that what you believe? It's what I have to believe. Otherwise, my brother died for nothing. And I can't accept that." She understood. They stood in that understanding for a long moment. Two people who had found something rare and fragile in the ruins of global catastrophe. Not quite friendship because the circumstances were too unequal. Not quite romance because the distance was too vast. But connection, recognition, the acknowledgement that they had seen each other truly and chosen mercy over hate. January 10th, 1946, the morning of departure. The women gathered in the compound with their small bags of belongings. Everything they owned in the world fit into canvas sacks that could be carried on one shoulder. They wore donated civilian clothes, dresses and coats provided by Red Cross, shoes that fit, scarves against the winter cold. Trucks waited at the gate to take them to San Francisco port, to the ships that would carry them across the Pacific to whatever remained of their homeland. Reiko held baby Megumi against her chest, wrapped in blankets. The infant was 2 months old now, still small but thriving. Sachiko stood with the younger women, her dignity intact despite everything. Emiko clutched her small collection of origami cranes, 27 cranes total, still far from the 1,000 that granted wishes, but enough to remind her that small acts of creation mattered even in places of confinement. The camp staff lined up to see them off: Commander Richardson, Nurse Walsh, the guards who had maintained order without cruelty, and Sullivan, standing slightly apart, medical bag over his shoulder even though there was no medical emergency. Just habit, perhaps, or the need to hold something familiar. Haruka walked to him. They had said their real goodbyes in private, but this public farewell still mattered. Corporal Sullivan, Miss Yamamoto, I will write to you if letters from Japan are allowed. I'd like that. And if I am ever able to visit America, I will come to Nebraska, to your farm. I'd like that too. They both knew it would probably never happen. The distance was too great, the political situation too complicated, the wounds too fresh. But saying it made it possible, gave it a shape in the world. She bowed formally. He saluted. Then in a gesture that surprised them both, they shook hands, her small hand in his large one. Enemy and protector, prisoner and guard, two people who had chosen to see each other as human. Sullivan approached one last time before the trucks departed. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper, still warm. Haruka opened it. Inside, 2 strips of bacon, cooked that morning, wrapped carefully in wax paper. A note in Japanese: so you remember, not just the fear, but the breakfast that changed everything. The moment you chose to trust. J.S. Haruka looked at the bacon, the same bacon from that first morning. The food that had cracked open her certainty about enemies. She took a bite, still warm, still delicious, still impossible. And this time she cried from gratitude, not confusion, because she understood now. This was not about bacon. This was about the courage to see humanity where propaganda demanded monsters. She wrapped the remaining piece carefully. She would save it, carry it across the ocean, a talisman against hate. The trucks started their engines. Time to go. Haruka climbed aboard with Emiko beside her, the canvas cover closed. The convoy began to move. She looked back one last time at Camp Coastal Monterey, at the barracks where she had learned that not all prisons were the same, at the infirmary where she had practiced medicine again and remembered who she was beyond being a prisoner, at the mess hall where she had tasted bacon and understood that food could be a bridge across hatred, and at Sullivan standing by the gate watching them leave, getting smaller as distance increased, finally disappearing around a curve in the road. Emiko leaned against her shoulder. Will we ever see them again, sister? I don't know. But you want to. Yes, I want to. The truck rattled toward the coast, toward the ships, toward Japan and whatever future waited there. Haruka touched the locket in her pocket, felt its weight, its promise of connection across impossible distance. She did not know what the future held, did not know if she would survive the return to her destroyed homeland, did not know if the letter she planned to write would ever reach Nebraska. But she knew one thing with certainty. She had been changed by this experience. Not broken despite all attempts to break her. Changed, made into someone who understood that mercy was possible even in war, that individuals could choose kindness even when nations chose violence, that bacon and hot water and stolen medicine and donated blood could mean more than 1,000 propaganda speeches. She would carry that knowledge back to Japan, would plant it like a seed in the ruins, would tell people what she had seen. Not everyone would believe her. Many would call her a traitor or a fool, would say she had been brainwashed by enemy kindness. But some would listen, some would understand, and maybe that would be enough. Tokyo, 1986, a small apartment in Shinjuku. Haruka Yamamoto, now 67 years old, sat at her desk surrounded by medical texts and patient files. She had become a doctor after returning to Japan, trained in the ruins, built a practice, delivered over 2,000 babies in her career. Each one reminded her of Megumi, of the night when mercy had saved lives. Her granddaughter Yuki, 16 years old, sat across from her doing homework. The girl looked up. "Grandmother, this letter came for you, from America." Haruka's hands shook as she took the envelope. The return address was a law office in Alliance, Nebraska. She opened it with care. Inside was a formal letter, legal language. But the essence was clear. James Sullivan had died, peacefully, surrounded by family, at age 65. He had never married, had lived his entire life on the family farm, had established a scholarship fund for Japanese American students after the war, had worked as a community medic, had lived quietly and well, and he had left her something in his will. The farm, on almost 160 acres, with a stipulation that she could sell it, visit it, or simply know it was there. Her choice. Enclosed was a personal letter, written in his final days. She unfolded it with trembling hands. "Dear Haruka, if you are reading this, I have finished my journey. I hope yours continues many more years. I wrote you 47 letters between 1946 and 1986. You wrote me 52. We never met again after you boarded that truck in California. But you were with me every day of my life. The war ended, but what we shared in that camp, that was the rarest thing in the world. The farm is yours now. Every morning I worked that land, I thought of you. Every seed planted was a prayer for healing between our peoples. Every harvest was hope that mercy outlives hate. Do not mourn me long. I lived fully. I died knowing I made the right choice in that camp. Saving you, Sachiko Reiko Megumi, that was the purpose of my survival. With deepest respect and yes, love, the quiet kind that crosses oceans, James Sullivan." Haruka read the letter 3 times. Then she wept. Yuki moved to comfort her, but Haruka waved her away gently. "These are not sad tears, child. These are grateful tears." Grateful for what? For being reminded that even in the darkest times, some people choose light, and that choice echoes across decades. She stood and walked to her small household shrine, placed Sullivan's photograph there beside the memorial tablets for her parents and brother. Lit incense. "Thank you, James Sullivan," she whispered in English, "for teaching me that humanity survives even when nations try to destroy it." Yuki watched her grandmother. "He was important to you. He showed me that enemies can become something else if we choose to let them. That is the most important lesson anyone ever taught me." Haruka stood at her window, looked east toward America, toward the farm she would never see but would always carry. On her desk, preserved under glass for 40 years, sat a small piece of wax paper, stained with grease, faded but intact. The wrapper from Sullivan's final gift, the bacon he had given her on departure day. She had never eaten that last piece, had saved it instead, carried it across the Pacific, kept it through decades of rebuilding. Not as food, as proof. Proof that in humanity's darkest hour, one man from Nebraska had chosen mercy over vengeance, had fed his enemies the breakfast his brother died protecting, had given blood to save an enemy infant, had offered friendship across an ocean of grief, and she had chosen to accept it. That choice had defined her life, shaped her into a doctor who delivered 2,000 babies, taught her that healing was always possible even after the deepest wounds. She touched the locket at her throat. "Thank you, Jim Sullivan," she whispered, "for teaching me that humanity survives, even when nations try to destroy it." Outside Tokyo glittered, rebuilt, thriving, a miracle born from ashes. Just like her, just like the friendship that had crossed oceans and outlasted war. She smiled, because some gifts last forever, even when they're wrapped in bacon grease and impossible hope.